Good day, my name is Rahim Oluwafumini. The title of my presentation is Luther versus Us, Encountering the Reformation Through the Eyes of an African Class. Basically, the presentation looks at some of the arguments raised amongst about 95 students in the class 10 years ago on the Reformation. So we'll be looking at some of these arguments within the context of this presentation. We have the introduction, we have the making of that class, because I'll be basically describing how that class emerged. Also, the presentation will be looking at some of the contentious issues raised in that class. We'll also be looking at how the Reformation led to the establishment of African independent churches in the early part of the 20th century, and of course the conclusion of the presentation. Now, in 1517, Martin Luther wrote what we call the 95 Theses. It was basically to challenge the sales of indulgences by the Catholic Church. He also had series of arguments that deals with belief, salvation, to mention a few. However, the class basically criticized some of Martin Luther's views about the Catholic Church, while some members of the class also were in support of series of the arguments raised by Martin Luther. So these are the arguments we basically want to argue within the context of this presentation. In 1517, Martin Luther wrote 95 Theses. It was basically a thesis that challenged the sales or the commercialization of indulgences by the Catholic Church at this time. However, his intention was basically to dispute against these doctrines and not to cause a rift or a division between him and the Catholic Church. Hence, his actions quickly snowballed into what we call the Protestant Reformation today. The making of a Reformation class basically talks about how about 95 students offered the course European History, where the Reformation was discussed. In the discussion, series of arguments came up, which of course I have termed the contentious issues. Among series of the issues that were raised in the class, three are germane to this presentation. One is that we were looking at how the Reformation emerged in 1517, because there are a series of arguments that claim that the Reformation did not happen in 1517, basically, that it had happened for as far as the 11th century. We also looked at how the Black Death also led to the weakening of the Catholic Church at this time, and of course we also look at the Papal Schism that brought about the rise of three popes in Europe at this time. The argument was basically that these events, amongst others, were responsible for the weakening of the church that led to what? The Reformation in 1517, led by Martin Luther. The another contentious issue was basically whether the Reformation was a revolt, a reformation, a revolution, or a restoration. Now, a part of the class believed that the 1517 event was a reformation, using the 95 Theses as a typical example. The 95 Theses aimed at reforming some of the doctrines and some of the dogmas of the church, especially within the context of the sales of indulgences. One other section of the class believed that Martin Luther's action was a revolt against the church, using series of examples. Our class instructor believed that the 1517 event was a restoration and of course a revolution, using series of examples, cited series of examples. For example, she claimed that the church had always been a very powerful institution. She believed that the church from the 11th century had unified Europe, and everybody in Europe at this time looked up to the church for solutions to all kinds of problems. So the church was basically seen as an infallible institution that could not do any wrong. So by the time Martin Luther came up with his thesis in 1517, it broke up that power that the church had wielded for centuries. So for her, it was basically what a revolution, against the Catholic Church. Now, the last contentious issues was basically whether Martin Luther was a Protestant or a hypocrite. Now, for those of us in the class who believed that Martin Luther was a Protestant, hinged their argument on Martin Luther's belief that mankind must look towards the Bible for salvation rather than the Pope for salvation. So for him, for this class, they believe that Martin Luther was sincere in his arguments against the church, while those people who believe that Martin Luther was a hypocrite hinged their arguments on some of the books Martin Luther had written at this time. For example, Martin Luther had written a book that praised the Jews. He argued that the Catholic Church should embrace the Jews, despite some of the arguments. So that's some of the arguments against them. But few years after, Martin Luther came up with another book that chastised the Jews and claimed that the Jews were not fit enough to live in Europe and that they should be persecuted or executed wherever they are founded. So this group who believed that Martin Luther was a hypocrite hinged their argument on these events. Now, on the issue of how the Reformation links with the rise of African independent churches in Africa, from the 1850s, the Church Missionary Society, under the auspices of the Anglican Church of Britain, began to Christianize Africans. Of course, they came to Africa alongside the Methodists, amongst other Protestant movements, had come to Africa to Christianize the people. But to make a success of their mission, they had to incorporate Africans into their fold. Now, these Africans were trained in Bible reading. They were also educated along Western lines. But these Africans also had attainments. They wanted to become, beyond being clerical officers or assistant bishops, they also wanted to become bishops. They also wanted to preside over large churches. But this could not be attained because of the European churches. The leaders in the European churches did not believe that Africans could attain such heights. So it was because of this reason, amongst other reasons, that these Africans eventually led a schism against mainline historic churches by moving away from these churches to set up what we call the African independent churches. Their belief was that Africans should also worship God in the African way, the same way Europeans worship God in the European way. So from the early part of the 20th century, we had series of African independent churches scattered across sub-Saharan Africa who worshipped God in their own ways. They came up with series of doctrines that were indigenous to the people, series of dogmas that were indigenous to the people. So this is how basically the Reformation links with the rise of African independent churches in Africa in the early part of the 20th century. Basically, the presentation looks at how students about 10 years ago viewed religious differences in Europe in the 16th century. The Reformation will be 500 years and it resonates across the world today. The effect of the Reformation resonates across the world today. Many across the world are either Catholics or, of course, follow one Protestant movement or the other. This is because of Martin Luther's actions in 1517. But personally, in my own view, I believe that Martin Luther's actions in 1517 was necessary owing to the fact that the church had gone astray for centuries, that had for years refused to reform itself. His actions basically promoted religious justice and religious tolerance, not only in Europe, but of course across the world. My name is Rahim Muluwafumini. Thank you for listening.